Hi guys, welcome back to VUDivulged. I'm Allie.
And I'm Josie. We're both from Legal Studies.
And today we're going to be talking about the Dyatlov Pass incident that happened in Russia in 1959. And I know we're both super excited to talk about this. So I'll just go ahead and give like a basic understanding of what I know about the Dyatlov Pass incident. So from what I understand is this was a group of pretty experienced hikers. It was 9 students, right, that were hiking in it was the Soviet Union at the time. And they went missing around the area of like the Ural Mountains, and specifically like the Gora Tortin area, I believe is what it was, and of the Soviet VUDivulged. I'm not gonna.
Yeah, disclaimer, we're not going to pronounce any of these
we are
right.
not going to be good at pronouncing these Russian names, so we're sorry in advance.
All right. Well, fun fact about that mountain, it was nicknamed Dead Mountain by the local Muncie tribe.
Oh, that is really interesting. I did not know that. And that it adds to the creepiness of this whole incident.
Yeah.
And as we go on, like, I know when I was reading about this, I just was appalled at like the amount of details. Because at first it was like interesting, and then it just got scarier and scarier.
Yeah.
And like, I almost couldn't sleep at night over it. Terrified
Something
me.
about those Russian mountains, man.
I know, yeah. And so these hikers, it was originally 10 hikers that set out on January 27th, 1959. And so there was one hiker, Yuri Yudin, that could not continue the trip due to joint pain, and it was actually the only survivor of this trip. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about Yuri later on, but these were students from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, which is now called the Ural State Technical Institute, and they were traveling while taking a break from their studies. So this was not their first time. They were pretty experienced hikers, and
What were they, like grade 2?
Yes, they were grade 2, and the fun fact is if they would have finished this, they would have been grade 3 experienced hikers, which is like the most what's the word I'm looking for? It's the most prestigious hiking level that you could be in Russia, actually.
Or the Soviet Union.
Or the Soviet Union at the time. And they were hoping to reach the mountain of Tortin, but unfortunately they did not.
No.
And around that time of the year, the weather was like negative 30 degrees Celsius, which is around negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit. It's hard for us like Fahrenheit people to understand Celsius degrees, but that's super cold. Like we rarely, in the Midwest, we rarely reach temperatures even close to that.
Light work for Russians, I guess, though.
Yeah. Oh, and the group also documented their entire trip with like cameras and journals, so that's how we know some of what happened, although it hasn't led us to like, there's a lot of details that got missed out on this whole thing that we like don't know anything about. But their bodies were discovered between the intervals of February 27th, between then and May 5th of 1959.
It's 2 months.
That's a long time.
Yeah.
And we'll get into the factors of like why it took them so long to find all of them, but most of it has to do with the fact that, you know, the Russian weather and the snow and everything, it was not easy to locate these bodies, from what I understand. And they had, the most interesting part about this is that their bodies had, and this is what has led to all the conspiracy theories on what happened, is that their bodies had really super strange injuries, like missing eyes and a missing tongue, that were unlikely to be caused by something unnatural. And I think I saw in the research that one of the scientists has said that the effects of their injuries were similar to something of like a car crash, which is really interesting.
Yeah.
Because why would they have effects like that on their bodies from whatever had caused this? And another really super interesting fact is that the bodies would have clothing with traces of radioactive material on them. Where did that come from? There are possible explanations, but they still like don't make sense completely. And some other strange facts include the fact that their tent was ripped from the inside out, meaning the hikers had fled their camp voluntarily, and that barely any of them had shoes. They likely left in a hurry. So whatever it was that caused this, they were trying to get out of their tent like really quickly, and then we don't actually know what happened from there on out. But then it is strange. But then this case was closed on May 28th, 1959, which isn't very much longer.
That's the same month that the last bodies were discovered.
That the last body was discovered, which is just really interesting because why did they close it so quick? And after closing the investigation, the authorities barred access to the mountain and the surrounding area for 3 years. So it's closed, but they still got it secluded, maybe for safety reasons, I imagine, because they didn't want other potential hikers to experience whatever phenomena caused these hikers to die. And so the hikers, the 10 hikers that originally set out, consisted of Igor Dyatlov, which is who the incident in the past that is named after. They ended up naming it after, he was like the leader of the group. And then we've got Yuri Dereshnika, who was a 21-year-old male. Igor was a 23-year-old male. So these were all pretty young students.
Yeah.
And it's really sad that they passed away at such a young age, not expecting to go through this event and lose their lives because of it. There's also Ludmila Dubinina. She was only 20 years old. There is Georgy Gravenchenka, and he was 23 years old. There was Alexander Kolovatov, and he was 24 years old. There was Zenata Komogorova, and she was 22. Rustem Slobodin, and he was 23. They're all about 23, it seems like. And then Nikolai Thubo-Brignoles. Is that how you would say that?
I have no idea, actually.
He was also 23. We've got Semyon Alexeyev, and he was 38 years old.
Pretty old.
Yeah, interesting that he was a lot older than the others. Oh, and then there was Yuri Yudin, who was the only survivor, and he was just 21 years old.
Well, he had to leave, he had joint pain.
He did.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which surprised that 38-year-old was able to go on, but Yudin was not, because...
Yeah, that's interesting. And little did Yuri know that this joint pain would eventually save his life.
Though I imagine he must have been kind of devastated, because that would have
I bet. Yeah. I bet he was probably excited to go on this hike, but, and then all of his friends die mysteriously on this hike. That's got to be such a weird thing to experience. And he actually said, if I could ask God just one question, it would be what really happened to my friends that night, which is just incredibly sad.
I know.
Can you imagine, losing all of your friends in one singular event like that?
I think he held a lot of guilt, survivor's guilt.
Yeah.
Even though he wasn't even on the trip and everything, but he had that guilt from what I've read in the Dead Mountain book by Donnie Eicher. Very good book, by the way.
Yeah.
But from what his interview said, not feeling great about that.
Yeah.
So, first of all, from what we know of the hikers, before the entire incident happens, they were met with pretty severe weather, and Igor Dyatlov made the decision to hunker down and pitch the tent. And actually, it's some surprising information. Their original destination, that tent was only 20 kilometers from it, so not that far for hikers.
Yeah, that's not that far.
Which just adds to the sadness of it all. They were so close to their destination, but I don't know, something happened.
Yeah.
And Yudin only realized they were missing because they said they'd send a telegram back after maybe 16 days, because that's what Dyatlov believed it would take. But of course, weeks went by, and their family members were also concerned too. So them and Yudin put pressure on the Soviet officials to investigate, and eventually, at the end of February, a search party was sent out. And on February 26th, the search party found them. And so what they found was, first of all, the tent. The tent was found halfway torn down, covered in snow, with everything arranged neatly and orderly. So this wasn't a they weren't scrambling out, panicked or anything, knocking stuff over. It seems like it was kind of orderly how they escaped.
Yes, but then the tent was ripped from the inside out.
Yeah.
So that, I don't know, that's kind of contradicting to did they escape in a hurry? I don't know.
They left behind almost all their material goods,
right.
Everything, including some cold weather gear, which, as you said, some of the footprints left behind, they didn't have like clear signs of like having shoes, and of course in that weather that's like pretty dangerous because frostbite. And the footprints seem to disappear a couple meters away from the tent, which isn't surprising because there's snow and snowing all the time covers the tracks. But something interesting, we'll get into this later, is that some of the certain bodies, like you mentioned, that they contained, like their clothing contained extremely high levels of radiation. And in fact, the entire campsite gave off extremely high levels of radiation, which is strange because I don't know, we'll get into them more with the theories and everything, but just adds to the entire strangeness of it.
Yeah, I don't know what could possibly explain that. I don't know.
Ooh.
I guess there are a few explanations, but they still don't make complete sense to me at all.
Yeah, not at all. So what led to the first bodies being discovered was this tree nearby. A day after the tent had been discovered, on February 27th, a search member noticed a cedar tree 1.5 kilometers away from the tent. So this was not far from the tent, and what looked to be an attempt of a fire started.
Which they would obviously want to start a fire because it's freezing.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine like because of the snow and everything, they didn't realize how close they were to the tent.
Right.
And everything. The trees had branches broken up to 5 meters high, which suggests, this is suggested, this isn't like confirmed, but suggests that the hikers had climbed, or someone had climbed up the tree to look for something. Or some people have said to hide from someone.
Ugh.
But that's just speculation right there, nothing confirmed.
Yeah.
The fire attempt was surrounded by small branches and presumed to have been cut by a Finnish knife. This is a very specific detail about this Finnish knife, which apparently a Finnish knife would have been like kind of a luxury blade during the Soviet Union at that time, which pretty strange, and purportedly it's never found, but I couldn't find like sources on that. Like the main sources for the Dyatlov Pass is like the organization surrounding trying to solve the mystery. So I gotta like trust them on this because there's really no other source, and I think everyone else is pulling from that site.
Yeah.
But I mean, they're pretty dedicated, so I gotta believe them.
So what makes the Finnish knife special?
I have no idea. It's just that the fact that purportedly it was never found, and that
Oh, yeah.
would be strange. But you also like later will see that there was some discrepancies in like the missing items. Like they could be easily like explained away by certain things and everything.
So an interesting note fact about the missing items is that some of the items presumed to be missing were in fact either found or consumed by other searchers. So that could be an explanation for some of the clothes that were missing. And from the Dead Mountain book, it says, in my interview with Boris Slobsov, for instance, he confessed that he and Mikhail Sharavin, after locating the tent, had drunk the hiker's flask of medicinal alcohol. So that kind of adds on to what you were saying about the explanation about some of the missing items.
Yeah, that's kind of funny though. Like, this is a missing persons case and everything. You're just drinking the evidence.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, why are they drinking? And it's medicinal alcohol. It's not like get drunk party alcohol.
And onto the bodies, of course. The leader's like, yeah, there's people around, like probably around the campfire, but the bodies themselves, first of all, the first one we found, Yuri Doroshenko, he was found wearing nothing but short-sleeved t-shirt, trunks, and socks, and was not wearing shoes. So first of all, that's suspicious, but you could like chalk it up to different things, which we'll get into later. But under Doroshenko's body, there were 3 to 4 cedar branches of the same tree, and the same thickness, which suggests that he was one of the ones trying to start the fire, which means he probably froze to death first. Probably, not confirmed, but you can probably speculate based on that. And then his injuries, well, there's large burns found on the body, scrapes and bruises all over the body, gray foam leaking out of the mouth, which is typically an indication of the injury of the chest cavity, which is strange.
This is something that I learned from this case. I did not know that that was an effect of anything at all. Gray foam coming from anyone's mouth just sounds horrid.
Yeah.
That sounds awful.
And experts describe the injuries as non-life-threatening and explain them with Doroshenko hitting himself with rocks and ice and other surrounding objects, and perhaps in a state of agony. That's not confirmed, but it's kind of what the experts thought it might be, like what they explained it away as. So like, the scrapes and bruises and everything. Well, you can explain the large burns by trying to start the fire, but
Right.
the scrapes and bruises, like the bruises.
Yeah. I don't know. It seems like there was a lot of weird indications of things that these hikers might have done in their final moments, from what I understand.
Yeah, though that is just what the experts like they try to explain it away as.
Right.
So we're just basing it off that. That's the only thing we have going on.
Yeah, exactly.
And his official cause of death was determined to be hypothermia. And something interesting, the evidence suggests, and it wasn't confirmed, that the body was moved after death. But that, like I said, not confirmed. But that's because of the livor mortis spots. You know, one of the 5 stages of death is like livor mortis. The spots from that were located at the back of the neck, torso, and its extremities, which wasn't consistent with the position that Doroshenko was found in, because I think he was lying on his front. So if the livor mortis spots were on his back and neck, then he would have been, during that stage of death, he would have been on his back.
Right.
He was found on his front.
Yeah, so something had to have flipped him over, apparently, between the point of which he died and then the point of which they found him, right?
Yeah, maybe the other hikers, but it's
Yeah.
still so strange that that would happen.
Yeah.
They would leave him like that, because if it's maybe trying to a sign of respect, then
Yeah,
I
that
don't
makes
know.
sense. But there are so many unexplainable injuries that happen to these poor hikers.
I know, and like,
I don't even think that's the strangest one.
no, definitely
not.
not. Definitely not. The second body near the campfire, Yuri Georgy, nicknamed Georgy by the others, Prevonishenko, and he was found, of course, next to the fire attempt. Is found with very little layering and a single sock, so still no shoes. And and his injuries included, he was heavily bruised and with cuts all over, and his temples were heavily bruised, burns all over the body, and something interesting, the skin of his own knuckle found in his mouth. So like he might have been biting into it around the time of his death.
They know it was the skin of his knuckle because I assume he had skin missing from his knuckle.
Yeah. And of course, there's evidence suggested that this body was moved. It was similar to the evidence on the first body, Doroshenko, but like I said, not confirmed.
It makes more sense that, like, if the other hikers would have moved these two, since they were the first two to pass, it makes the most sense that they would have been positioned differently after their passing, just because the other hikers had possibly found them before.
Yeah. Although we don't know if they were the first ones to pass, we just like
Right, they were just
confirmed.
first found. But I assume that they were the first found because they were closest to the campsite.
Yeah.
So it might make sense that the other hikers found them, I don't know, closer to the campsite. I don't know.
Yeah, and it's heavily suggested, since these two didn't have like clothing on their bodies, that the other hikers took the clothes off of them. But there's also this little bit about paradoxical undressing, which we'll probably get into later.
Yes,
You'll definitely
I
talk
find
about.
so intriguing. So then, those are the first two hikers found.
Yeah.
And then there were 2 more bodies found just a couple hundred meters away from the other 2 bodies. And so one of those was Igor Dyatlov, who was the leader of the group. He was found 300 meters away from that cedar tree that you mentioned, and found with his face and both of his fists clenched. Kind of similar to the features of the other 2. And he was found dressed better for the weather, interestingly enough, but he still had no shoes. None of these poor hikers seemed to have shoes at all. And his injuries included abrasions and cuts all over his face and ankle, a missing tooth in the jaw, bruises on his right hand, similar to those that came from fist fighting. And his official cause of death was hypothermia. And so evidence suggests that the body was moved after death, but it is not confirmed.
Yeah.
And then also there was Zenaida Komogorova, and she was found 630 meters away from that cedar tree. She was better dressed for the weather as well, but her right sleeve of her sweater was torn, and she still had no shoes. And her injuries included abrasions on both hands, bruises on her face and right side of the torso, frostbite on her fingers, and her official cause of death was also determined to be hypothermia. and there was evidence to suggest that her body was moved after death, but it's also not confirmed. And there were also liver mortar spots found on top of her body rather than on the bottom.
So it's kind of like a flip-flop of the
Yes,
first two bodies.
Exactly.
And there seems to be a trend of like abrasions on like the hands.
Yes.
The injuries of the hands and everything, which is, I don't know.
And she had frostbite, so I wonder if that means that she was alive for a longer period of time than some of the others.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, she was better dressed.
She was better dressed, but she still had frostbite. I don't know. But her official cause of death was hypothermia. There was another body found on March 5th, 1959.
So like a week after the first body?
Yes, about a week. And so this was Rustem Slobodin, and he was found 480 meters away from the cedar tree. And he was found face down. He was better dressed with several layers of clothing, including a long sleeve undershirt, a shirt, a sweater, 2 pairs of pants, and 4 pairs of socks. I wonder if he might have taken the clothes off the other, because how did he get 4 pairs of socks?
I know.
Surely, if he left in a rush with the other hikers, he would have left also sockless and shoeless, maybe not, and maybe the others were sockless and shoeless because some of the other hikers had taken the clothing off after they passed, or maybe they gave them up.
Yeah. That's true. Or maybe he just goes to sleep with 4 pairs of socks. You never know.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was very cold, but he only had 1 shoe on, which is really interesting. 4 pairs of socks, 1 shoe.
And you would think the other hikers would take the other shoe.
Right. And so his injuries included internal bleeding on his head, small bruising, abrasions, and swelling on his head, 2 scratches on his head, bruising on his hands, and a fracture of the frontal bone, which was thought to have caused by blunt trauma. And then his official death was also hypothermia, and evidence suggested that the body was moved after death, but that was also not confirmed. And then there were liver mortar spots on the top of his body rather than on the bottom.
So suggested that him and what is her name?
Zenaida
were moved too.
Yeah.
Like, oh, wow. The search would stagnate until like 2 months later, on May 5th, 1959, where the remaining 4 bodies would be found. So we found 5, but there's still 4 more to go. And they would be discovered by a Mansi native, like the local indigenous tribe, and his dog when they noticed some cut branches forming a trail, like they were out. They noticed these cut branches and they follow it. They find clothing, cedar branches, a young tree missing its top, and more clothing, thought to have belonged to the remaining hikers. And this leads them to the remaining bodies, which were found in a small den hidden from the wind, which means that they were probably maybe the remaining survivors, and then they made the conscious decision to try to hide from the wind, so from the cold somehow.
Right.
And family members of the victims noted that during the funeral services, the victims' bodies appeared to be giving off an unnatural glow, and said that some of their hair had gone gray. And these were like 20-something-year-olds, so. And one of the first bodies to be found was Ludmila Dumanina. And her body was found draped over a natural edge with water rolling over it. She was far better dressed for the weather than the previous bodies found, but still had no shoes. So, like, none of these people have shoes.
Yeah.
And her injuries consisted of soft tissue on her face, which was missing, and enough tissue to be missing to show bone in certain areas. Damaged tissues around the left temporal bone, which I think would be around here.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is the most interesting part. Her eye sockets are empty and her eyeballs are missing. Her nose cartilage was broken and flattened, and her tongue was missing. With
Sounds
some
like
muscles of the mouth missing.
It sounds like she had some of the worst injuries, like that.
I know. And she had 10 ribs broken.
I mean, is there evidence to suggest whether this, what was the cause of her death?
Oh, this is actually interesting.
Okay.
So she had a massive hemorrhage in the heart's right atrium. And injuries were suggested by the forensic investigator to not have been caused by anything human, though that's not confirmed. It's just what he thought. But his cause of death, I don't think hypothermia is mentioned in her cause of death. It's hemorrhaging of the heart, multiple broken ribs, and internal bleeding, all in combination that brought upon her death. It's not like she succumbed to hypothermia. It's those injuries that she succumbed
because I was curious whether it was those injuries that had been part of the, what had killed her, or if those injuries to her body had came afterwards.
Now, it wasn't the missing eye or anything, but it was just like the hemorrhaging in her heart.
Yeah.
Which is strange to me.
Yeah.
And further on, Semyon Zolartov, I think I pronounced that right, the oldest one, he was also far better dressed for the weather. But he had shoes this time.
Ooh.
So that's like, what?
Yeah.
6 of them didn't have shoes, and now this guy has shoes.
Yeah.
He was found with a camera around his neck, which some of the pictures from that camera will be relevant to future theories. And his injuries consisted of injuries to the chest with 5 broken ribs, a missing tissue along the left eyebrow, which left bone exposed, an open wound on the right side of the skull with bone exposed. And again, his eye sockets were empty and his eyeballs were missing.
Yeah.
So it's like
that's a lot of missing eyeballs.
Yeah, that's like 4 total.
Yeah. I mean, there can only be so many things that explain missing eyeballs.
Yeah, I mean, like insects eating after they die, but then you'll see later on others didn't have their eyeballs missing.
Right.
So I don't know. His cause of death was ultimately determined to be a combination of hypothermia and the fractures of his ribs with internal hemorrhaging. And again, his injuries were suggested to not be caused by anything human. The forensic expert, when asked about Dubinina and Zolotarev, he said, quote, "These wounds, especially appearing in such a way without any damage to the soft tissue of the chest, are very similar to the type of trauma that results from the shock wave of a bomb," end quote.
But I've also heard that these injuries are very similar to the effects of a car crash.
Yeah.
But both kind of make sense to me because...
Like high impact.
Yes. Especially like eyeballs missing, I think could be explained like by both of those incidents. Lots of abrasions, really odd bruising, things like that I think could be explainable by both. But so for the last 2 bodies, we've got Alexander Kolovatov, who was dressed better for the weather, similarly to some of the others, with multiple layers, but was missing shoes and hats. The waistband of his sweater and the lower parts of his trousers did test positive for radioactive material. His injuries included missing both of his eyebrows, and his bone showed through. His nose was deformed, his neck was deformed. There was an open wound behind his right ear. His overall skin had a gray-green color with a tinge of purple. That is a very specific description for how his skin looked.
Well, maybe it's because, they were found like 2 months later.
Right, yes. It could be that because, post-mortem, I think is the right word.
Yeah.
Causes some strange things to happen to the human body, especially when it's in temperatures like that. I don't know the specific effects of something like that, but that could be an explanation. And his official cause of death was hypothermia. And we've also got Nikolay Brignol, and he was perhaps the most prepared for the cold. He had several layers of clothing, shoes perfect for the Russian weather, and I wonder if he had more than four pairs of socks, because that was a lot of socks.
I know.
His injuries included bruising on his lips and the lower left side of his face, internal bleeding on his forearm. His skull was fractured and cracked, and his cause of death was determined to be by the fracture of the skull.
Though I do want to note that all of these injuries, they're coming from translations from people who are very dedicated to this case. There's no official translation of the autopsy report from the forensic coroner, I believe. So these are just translations from other people who are very dedicated to this case. So there could be discrepancies in what they translated.
Right.
But this is my only source because I don't know Russian. Though interesting, Nikolai must have been outside the tent at the time, or preparing to.
Yeah. What makes you say that?
Well, because he had like he's the only one with shoes. Because I think then that makes me think that before this all happened, he was like planning to go out into the cold, or maybe he was the last one in, and they had just unpacked or something. I don't
That's a
know.
good point.
I think all 4 remaining bodies had traces of radioactive material on them.
Yeah.
Right?
That's a lot of radioactive material, though. Like, where did that come
I
from?
know. And I think something important to also note is that since these were like the last bodies found, presumably the last to die, they probably took clothing for the other people. So I think other
Yes.
people could have had this radioactive material on them too.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. So there are several theories that a lot of people have come up with to explain what caused these events and what caused all these injuries. And one of the most popular ones is a natural phenomenon, which was the possibility of a slab avalanche. And this theory kind of explains why they left the tent and the number of injuries that they had. And there was a belief that there was a compelling nature force or a compelling natural force that it was a snow slab avalanche. And because in a snow slab avalanche, the surface layer of snow is compact, dense, and heavy. The snow beneath this crust is weaker, and when the crust breaks free from the underlying weaker snow, it forms a slab that moves down a slope. And I think that, if a big slab of snow came down and crushed them, that could have possibly explained why they appeared to be crushed.
Yeah.
You know, how they said they had injuries that were somewhat similar to that of a car crash. That makes sense to me. But some people have created models that demonstrate that a slab avalanche could occur on a gentle slope and under the right conditions, even if the angle is not right for it. So we're going to show a demonstration of what that looks like. So this model demonstrates what it would look like potentially if a slab avalanche did come down. I think that there's a possibility that the slab could have came down and startled them, and then that's like when they escaped, and then they could have either been killed from the slab avalanche that came down and crushed them, or by hypothermia from trying to escape from that because they were startled and left in a rush.
Yeah. So like, imagine this. There's a slab coming. There's like there's a loud avalanche coming, and you don't know what it is because imagine they just woke up in the middle of the night.
Right.
Maybe.
Yeah,
but,
and it's dark.
Yeah, and it's snowy, and there's a bunch of weird things out there.
Right.
And you just hear this loud noise, and then they panic, and they escape out. They cut through the tent, presumably, escape out, and they run down the hill. So this is presuming that they're on a hill in the first place, so this is an angle.
Right.
We can see later on that there's some theories, there's some evidence against the avalanche, and that the whole point of like some of the people not believing it to be an avalanche is because the slope wasn't steep enough for an avalanche to happen.
Yeah, I think that a slab avalanche, is a pretty plausible explanation. I mean, it doesn't explain everything, but I think it explains the majority of the injuries that at least occurred and them escaping in a rush.
Yeah.
I think people really underestimate the effects of a slab avalanche. Granted, I've never been in a slab avalanche, but I know that it's like the snow is super compacted, and so I think that would have the ability to crush somebody and cause some really interesting injuries.
Yeah.
Just because it's not just snow, like it's ice and it's all compacted, it's super heavy.
Which would explain some of the abrasions, the bruises, the cuts, the fractures.
Yes.
But, But not the eyeballs.
And not the radioactive material that was found on their clothing. That doesn't explain that even one little bit.
No, absolutely not. There's a whole study from these 2 scientists about what happened, what might have happened in the Dyatlov Pass, and that study that they did, not this model, but that study and the model that they did was kind of inspired by Frozen, like the physics of the snow and Frozen. But like with animation, it's like they have to be very considerate of the physics of everything too, if you want it to be believable.
Right.
So they had to study that. So like how the snow, like the model the animation studio created for the snow, might have inspired these people it did inspire these people for like and how to model what might have happened at the Dyatlov Pass.
Right. I find that extremely interesting.
Yeah.
So with the possibility of a slab avalanche, there were also katabatic winds that potentially occurred. And these are winds that carry down a slope under the force of gravity. And they can accelerate into hurricane-like speeds in high-density air. They can initiate when colder air from above displaces warmer air at the bottom. And it can happen very quickly. And it could have caused a surprise avalanche that otherwise very experienced hikers would have prepared for, or a kind of avalanche that could have been quickly covered by ensuing snowfall.
So that's actually relevant to the evidence against this whole natural avalanche theory, because the rescue team did not find any obvious evidence of an avalanche or its deposition, which, if it was a kind of avalanche that could have been covered by snowfall very easily, then, I don't know, then the evidence against doesn't really apply, kind of.
Yeah.
When you think about it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But then you also have to think about the average slope of this above the tent site was less than 30 degrees, which is not steep enough for an avalanche.
Yeah.
And I don't think the area in general was not ideal for an avalanche, because from what I've read of analysis of the area, I think it might have been kind of a flat area.
Yeah.
Overall, just not steep enough for an avalanche.
Yeah.
So something interesting on a theory on why they left the tent in such a hurry is tornadoes and infrasound panic. Because due to the unique topography of Dead Mountain, which is a perfect dome shape, the fierce mountains that blow through the pass could have been warped as they struck the blunt surface of the mountain surface, and which would have made perfect conditions for a wind phenomenon called the Kármán vortex street, which could have created small tornadoes. And what the Kármán vortex street is, it's a wind phenomenon that could have produced a terrifying, powerful sound which is proven to induce irrational fear in humans, which is caused by the tornado. And even if the tornadoes had not directly impacted the camp, which we saw the scene of, well, we didn't see it, but we created the scene of the camp and everything was orderly, so there's probably not tornadoes affecting the camp, but they didn't have to affect the camp. They could have been close enough where the sound of the Kármán vortex street would have been so high-pitched that it produced a panic in the Dyatlov Pass hikers. And this noise would have been what you call an infrasound noise, which is a type of vibration it's a noise that produces a vibration that's low enough to not be heard or high enough to not be heard, but still felt. And this is proven by studies. And a succession of studies has shown that the Kármán vortex street can have marked effects on the human body, including loss of sleep, shortness of breath, and extreme dread. So it's suggested, from this theory, that a wind phenomenon called the Kármán vortex street could have produced an infrasound noise that incited a panic among the hikers, so much so that they fled the tent in a panic and were injured and died in the process.
So another possible theory, due to the radiation, was the idea that because there was beta radiation detected on the hikers' clothing, it led to theories that some sort of weapon, possibly a nuclear weapon, could have detonated or exploded near the camp. But however, the radiation detected would have led to have been 50 to 100 times the level detected to reach dangerous or alarmingly abnormal amounts of radiation. So it doesn't entirely explain it, because although there was radiation, there wasn't a lot of it. And there was no radiation detected on the victims' belongings, which is really interesting, because why are they covered in radiation, but their belongings are not?
Yeah, though I do want to note very quickly that some of the students worked near radioactive material because they were at the Polytechnical Institute, and so Yuri Krivonishenko, one of the first bodies found, and missing clothing. You know, because he worked at a facility, he could have easily had that nuclear stuff on him, but the other hikers might have taken it for him.
Yeah.
So we gotta note that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And another thing on the paradoxical undressing, why don't you talk about this?
Oh, well, I was going to let you talk about the paradoxical undressing because you know a lot more than I do, but I find it fascinating.
Yeah.
And from what I understand, it's basically this phenomenon where victims of hypothermia start undressing because they feel their body warming up. And it's a sign of latent hypothermia. And it could be a possible explanation for why the bodies are missing clothes, but I do feel like the possibility of the other hikers taking the clothes off, the ones that have already passed or are dying, is probably more likely because some of the hikers have way more clothes than the other ones.
Oh yeah. Now there's possibly some more sinister motives behind this whole thing. Like there's some pretty not gruesome, I'll say gruesome, theories related to the disappearance and the injuries. And some people believe, well, this was quickly discarded by Soviet officials, but some people believe that the Mansi people, the local indigenous tribe, killed them for either trespassing or for human sacrifice, or possibly just to steal their belongings. And I guess you can look at, there is some potential evidence, as in the Mansi people had multiple sacred places scattered throughout the Ural Mountains. And there was a Mansi shelter located around 60 meters away from the Dyatlov camp. And of course, some items were missing from the camp. But then again, you pointed out before,
So there is evidence against this, though.
Yeah.
So it's not a known common ritual amongst the Mansi people to do human sacrifices. Additionally, that specific mountain had no hunting or spiritual value for the Mansi people, that is known of. And they're historically really peaceful people.
Yeah.
And even a quote from a witness report by Pavel Makhtyryevov is, "Everyone goes to this mountain, Russian men and women, Mansi. There is no special prohibition to hike this mountain."
And he was a Mansi native, wasn't he?
Yeah. Also, there wasn't anything that they would consider valuable missing from that. So,
yeah,
such as the alcohol,
which was drank,
which is drank by the searchers. Yeah, but that was a popular theory at the time. And it led to several Mansi people being interrogated in 1959, it seems like. But like you said, it was quickly discarded. So.
Yeah, and I just can't, it's mostly circumstantial and everything.
Yeah.
All the evidence for it.
That's
so
a good point.
I can't, and also, it might stem from just biases at the time.
Right, yeah, which is probably why the Mansi people were initially interrogated.
Well, coming away from local tribes, something I thought was pretty interesting was a private investigator thought that maybe they were killed by escaped Gulag prisoners, or maybe they were killed for being mistaken as Gulag prisoners. Because at this time, well, Stalin's dead because he died in 1953, 6 years before the Dyatlov Pass incident.
Yeah.
But there have been cases where Gulag prisoners have escaped and they've kind of led their own life very quietly. But some of them maybe they didn't hear about Stalin's death, and subsequently where a lot of political prisoners were given amnesty afterwards. So maybe they didn't hear, the hikers spotted them, and they were killed for being witnesses.
Yeah.
But then again, there's not a lot of evidence for that.
You would think that if it was prisoners that had escaped, they would want to lay low and not cause some sort of, big uproar.
Yeah.
So it doesn't seem that plausible to me. I could see why conspiracies might lead to something extravagant like that, but
yeah, there's also the injuries, they just don't align.
Yeah, that's true. And also the fact that the tent was slashed from the inside. indicating that it probably wasn't an attack from outsiders that slashed the tent.
Yeah, I just don't see it personally, but I don't know. Pretty interesting, I thought.
Yeah, it is. Another conspiracy is that it was a secret spy cover-up, which I find really interesting. This theory that came from it was a theory that the campers stumbled upon a military testing area and were either killed by Soviet soldiers protecting the area or were scared into fleeing by the sounds of nearby explosions. However, on the days that the expedition was underway, launches were carried out by the Kasputin Yar training range, but it was not visible from the pass. But also a military testing area kind of would make more sense why there would be radiation. I think that would be a really good explanation for that, and I think that's what led a lot of people to that conspiracy.
Yeah, and maybe the military testing wasn't seen from the past, but maybe they heard it and were still startled, or something like that. I can believe that maybe they were close to a site, but I don't think that they were close enough that officials would have come down and done something to them.
Yeah, and there just wasn't enough evidence that would have shown. I mean, although they did have some really interesting injuries, those injuries don't indicate a full-blown explosion, which I think kind of is a valid point against why it probably wasn't. It doesn't mean that there couldn't have been, military testing site nearby and that explained the radiation, but I don't know if they were bombed. That doesn't seem very plausible to me.
Yeah, and the tent.
Yeah, the tent perfectly intact,
No, can't see it. Though there is also related to the government, but kind of a lot more crackpot, in my opinion, is that there's this theory that 3 of the men were KGB agents, which is the equivalent of the CIA in the Soviet Union at the time, and they got into a conflict about it. And this theory is 3 of them KGB agents, and the others didn't know, so it was I guess a cover-up for them, a reason to go to the site undercover, maybe. And the story is, from this theory, they were going to root out an American CIA cell, pretend to cooperate with the US by delivering radioactive materials so that they could photograph them, which would allow for the Russian government to identify these American CIA agents. And then the theory is the meeting went wrong and a fight broke out, and thus all that happened. But I don't know, I just don't think that's possible, because the others, I don't know, why would the others get killed? Why would they bring the others into that conflict in the first place?
Yeah, of all of the things to this feels far-fetched, where was this pulled from? Why? I don't know, it feels very
it's low-key
random,
kind of disrespectful.
Yeah, that too.
The families of the victims do not support this at all,
right.
And I understand, because what the heck?
Yeah, I don't know. That is a very interesting and kind of wild conspiracy. Yeah.
Yeah, imagine your family member, your loved family member, they go missing and they die a pretty brutal death.
Yeah.
And then someone's out there being they were CIA agents. And,
yeah.
I don't know.
People, I don't know what led people to that. Do you feel that's I just feel that's really far out there. Where did they get that from? Of all the things they could have decided upon, and this is a pretty popular conspiracy. A lot of people seem to think this. I don't know if it's a more recent one or back during 1959 when things were more politically adverse.
No, that could be it.
Yeah.
That could be it. Ooh, I didn't think about the politics around time surrounding that. Oh.
Yeah.
Well, clearly though, Yuri Yudin definitely doesn't think that, because he was actually interviewed, and from the book Dead Mountain by Donnie Eicher, who did make friends with Yuri Yudin and did interview him, he said that one of the things that hurt Yudin most was how Igor and the others had been portrayed. In some of the published books, he felt were merely searching for a lurid angle on the story. There's some other theories where there was infighting amongst the group, but Uden said, quote, much has been made of the hikers' relationship with the opposite sex, and that somehow, arguments with the girls led to their deaths. This, he said, is bullshit, end quote. So he really doesn't, that's not related to the KGB, but I imagine he doesn't subscribe to that, and he doesn't subscribe to any theories related to infighting. And even though some of those hikers, they had injuries that might have been from a fight, he doesn't believe so.
Yeah. And I mean, I want to give him credit where credit is due, because he was also an experienced hiker. He knew these people, and he had, you know, I feel like he would have an idea of some of the events that would lead up to what caused the death. Like, he would have a better understanding than me, or, you know, you, or an inexperienced hiker, of what could have potentially led to it. So I feel like it's plausible to listen to his explanation, and it does, you know, make sense.
Yeah, and he even says so in the same Dead Mountain book, that in response to like the interrogator's questions, Uden made it clear that he didn't think the fate of his friends had anything to do with natural phenomena. He said, quote, the number one possibility in my mind is that it was people who came with guns because they were in an area they shouldn't have been, or they saw something they shouldn't have seen, end quote. And from the book it says, he went on to say that armed men had coerced the hikers into fabricating a scene to throw off investigators. The men forced them to walk into the forest half naked and to shred their own clothes before being left to die. Quote, so they were forced to do it to create this kind of madness, end quote. And another thing that's mentioned in the book is that, quote, the clue that convinced Uden that the hikers had been led by gunpoint was Dubinina's missing tongue. Uden said, quote, if it had been a mouse, it would have happened to everyone, to all the bodies, end quote. Kind of in response to like some other skeptics being like, well, it could have been like an animal or something. So it's kind of interesting that Uden thinks like that this was like malicious in a way.
Yeah.
And he believed that, this is from the book, that someone had singled out Dubinina for punishment, like, 'cause she's the one with the missing tongue, perhaps as a warning for talking too much. Quote from the book.
Yeah, I don't know. That is a very violent, like, theory. There's also talk about government papers and how some people believe that there is more to the case and that the key is within secret government case files. However, according to the Dead Mountain book, Soviet law requires criminal case files to be legally destroyed after 25 years if no appeals were filed for that case during that time. And the Soviet government did not destroy the Dyatlov documents even when they had the chance to, and they were even released in the late 80s and early 90s. So this would have been during a period where other Soviet documents that detailed government blunders were being released. So why would they conceal what happened to 9 hikers in the Ural Mountains?
When other stuff, like, there's definitely like other government blunders that they wouldn't have wanted released, but it was being released. So why hide the truth about the 9 hikers?
Yeah, you would think there would be more serious issues than the hikers, but then again, like, if something, you know, we don't know for sure, that could have been something.
Yeah, and they kept the files alive and everything. So and it's open to the public. So.
Right.
The case was reopened in 2019, even though you said that it was closed pretty quickly in the same year as its incidents, but it was reopened by the Attorney General, and at the time, Russia's Prosecutor General had said they were only going to look into like what was connected with natural phenomena. So it was just 3 theories that seemed like the most likely ones. He said, quote, I would say his name, but it's like, I don't know if I could pronounce that, Alexander Kurenai, maybe. He said, quote, crime is out of the question. there is not a single proof, even an indirect one, to favor this criminal version. It was either an avalanche, a snow slab, or a hurricane, end quote. So I guess a hurricane would be like the tornado theory.
Yeah.
And they said they were going to rely on modern technology and help from the families and the friends of the victims.
Yeah, and I think the prosecutor, well, I think it's, first of all, really interesting that it was opened in 2019, so many years later. It's not like they're going to find more evidence. They have to go based on what they already know.
Yeah.
But they did ultimately conclude that it was a slab avalanche. So the families of the victims actually don't accept that conclusion, and a lawyer with the public fund in memory of Dyatlov also doesn't agree with the conclusion reached by the prosecutor general's office and said, the relatives will not accept this conclusion. The theory that the group was killed by an avalanche, only a technogenic theory, is possible. In effect, this investigation has not produced anything.
Interesting.
Yes.
Well, the thing is, what gets me is that they were looking into natural phenomena, like as the only options, but it was so far away from when the crime scene happened. I don't know how effective that really was.
Right.
Like looking at the natural phenomena of what happened, it's not going to be, I don't think it's going to be the same at all.
Yes.
So,
I mean, I think, especially pertaining to like an avalanche, it probably would have effects on the human body that we are not aware of. Like, I don't know exactly the effects that a slab avalanche would have and how it would injure people. And they did determine that the cause of death for most of these victims was hypothermia.
yeah.
But they still had these significant injuries. I think it's reasonable that a slab avalanche could have at least startled them to where they, left the tent. That makes perfect sense to me. And it makes sense why it was difficult to discover the bodies. They could have been hidden under the snow and difficult to find. And they also could have been trapped under the snow, and that's why they died from hypothermia. But then also, if they were, initially crushed by a slab avalanche, how would the other hikers have been able to reach the other bodies and taken the clothes off of those bodies?
Yeah.
That's another thing to think about.
And
were they able to reach each other?
Yeah, and the last four, I think they were alive for a while because they were
Yeah.
able to go quite a distance from the original campsites. So they were.
Were they alive though when they had these injuries,
That's
or
true.
did they die late? I'd like to look more into the evidence to show if they had attempted any medicinal or care towards any of their wounds.
Oh yeah.
Seeing as if they didn't die from these injuries, you would think that they would try to do something to, I don't know. We know that they potentially took clothes off the other hikers' bodies, but that doesn't, I guess if you have a fractured skull, there's not much you could do. And I believe that one victim did die from the fractured skull.
Yeah.
But for the others, was one of the victims who didn't have their eyes, were they alive for that time that they didn't, or did that happen after the death? I think that's an important factor. If we had more details into that, I think we would have a better explanation of what happened.
Yeah, I totally agree and everything. It's just that this entire case, there's so many things that could align, but they just don't. They barely miss each other. And that's what makes this case so fascinating to me.
Which conspiracy theory stands out the most to you? What do you think is the most likely to have occurred?
Now, the most likely...
Or multiple. It could have been the Yeti people and the aliens.
Oh, yeah, you never know. They might have teamed up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They could have fought, and maybe the repercussions of the fight is what caused all the injuries to our
don't get between
here.
aliens and Yetis,
Yeah,
guys.
yeah.
Dangerous stuff.
Yeah.
Though, most likely, though, I actually think the infrasound panic I mentioned before with the Kármán vortex treat, I think it could have been a combination of that theory and maybe an avalanche.
Okay.
I know those were we talked about them separately, but since they're natural phenomena that could have happened at the same time,
right,
it just could have been a combination of all those.
Right. I mean, that makes sense too, but I definitely think that it was more likely for a natural phenomena than the aliens, but that's just me.
I mean, with yeah, I guess the avalanche is the most plausible theory, but you gotta think like radioactive
Yes.
stuff. I can't fathom that.
It almost makes me wonder if for some reason, like, it depends how big the slab was. If I don't think that picture that we showed, that model, does it justice, because it could be a huge slab. We don't know how far up it could have come from. It could have come from a really high up on the mountain. And say there was some military testing site with radioactive material, and say that like material from up there, the radioactive like snow or anything like that, fell down onto the hikers, and that's what caused it. I don't know.
It's so strange. I just can't. Oh, and remember, some of the students worked at radioactive factories.
Oh, okay. I think that explains that pretty well then. I would just say it was a slab avalanche, and it makes sense that their clothes, of all the things, like if they work at the factory, their belongings aren't going to be covered in radioactive material the same as clothes are.
Yeah.
So that makes sense with that.
Yeah. But it's not as fun. Well, granted, this case isn't a fun case, but some of these theories, I just can't with them.
Yeah.
They're just Yetis, KGB agents. Yetis and KGB. Yetis are the KGB agents.
Oh, there's
my
one.
gosh.
Yeah, that's good.
Then keep in mind, all speculation, but
yeah,
still
these
strange.
are just other people's ideas of what could have possibly happened to these victims. Although it was concluded that it was a slab avalanche, there's a lot of factors that play into it, and so it's just interesting to think about all the theories that people have come up with.
Yeah, though ultimately though, it is sad that 9 hikers that were so excited for this trip lost their lives.
And their families didn't get closure. Their families had to see them in a devastating state.
And they gotta deal with like weird conspiracies.
They do, and some of them are kind of disrespectful. So my heart goes out to the families as well.
Yeah.
It's just sad. But
And you didn't though. He has passed. He passed in 2013. Yeah. And do you feel like, I don't know, do you feel like you know more about like Russian history now?
I feel like I know so much. I knew nothing about this case beforehand, and it honestly, I didn't know how interested I was in it before, and then I started looking into it, and it just got creepier and weirder and more interesting, and now like I'm glad I know about this, because this is, I don't know. Thank you for educating me on the Dyatlov Pass incident. I think that wraps it up for this episode.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for watching, and hope you enjoyed our episode about the Dyatlov Pass incident.
Well, we hope we meant no disrespect to any of the victims whatsoever, because this is all speculation, and we're just 2 college students yapping.
Yeah. But we hope you guys will watch again next week when we have our episode over the Secret Service.
Yeah.
Thank you.